All right, everyone, welcome to another edition of Ego Media Mayhem with your host, Lady J, right here on JQLM Radio, another division of Ego Entertainment Network. And so today we are going to be speaking with a great guest, and we have a very interesting story for you all today. And so today we're going to be talking about the case of Lucinda Diaz in Edinburgh, Texas, who was charged with the murder of her husband after being married for 6 months. But she was acquitted of the charges. And so today we have with us her attorney, Juan Tierina. Hopefully I said that right. We're going to bring him in real quick. Tell everyone a little bit about yourself. We know that you're an attorney, but can you tell everyone what type of attorney you are, a little bit about your background and the background with this case?
Sure. I've been practicing in the state of Texas now. It's almost 17 years. I have worked as a prosecutor and as a criminal defense attorney for most of that time. I do also have a master's in clinical psychology, so I think that's beneficial in terms of the work that I do. But this is the kind of cases I do: murder cases, capital murder cases, and it's one of those things that I'm passionate about and prideful of the work that I do.
Awesome. So this particular case was very interesting to me because, she was charged with her husband's murder, and she told the police several times, and the jury, that he committed suicide. It was found, though, according to the medical examiner report, that he was shot in the back of the head. So can you tell everyone why that could be possible? Because most people would think, well, nobody shoots themselves in the back of their head if they want to kill themselves. Most people put the gun in their mouth or to the side of their head or in the front of their head or, something of that sort. So can you explain that to everyone who may question those facts?
Absolutely. And that was one of the reasons why the police went forward with charging her for murder, because it was such it was kind of in talking to having the expert testify, the pathologist, in all of his career, and he had practiced throughout the country. He had never seen a suicide case where someone had shot themselves in the back of the head. So it was essentially up in this area here. A lot of the officers testified as to they had never seen that either. And that was one of the things that drew the officer's suspicion and ultimately led to charging her with murder and arresting her for murder. So it was a matter of convincing a jury that it is possible for someone to shoot themselves in the back of the head, and evaluating all the evidence. The way I looked at it was, because according to my client, Ms. Diaz, he had done this before where he had put a gun to his head. I truly believe that he was trying to get her attention, and she never exited the bedroom in which she states that she was in when this occurred, and ultimately ended up shooting himself. I really don't think he intended to. I think it was more so of an accident, but it was just one of those things that was so suspicious that was a large part of why the police ended up charging her with the murder.
Okay, so at the time of his death, she was pregnant, correct?
That's correct. She currently has a 2-year-old son. So she was pregnant at the time of his shooting. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I read somewhere where she stated that she did not want to keep the child. Was that true, or was that something that was just speculation?
Well, it's something that was said shortly after it happened, but I think she was more so in shock and so distraught, for the loss of her husband, that crossed her mind. She did shortly after the shooting. She was actually hospitalized and treated for issues with depression and medicated. And so she did do much better after that. But yes, it was one of the issues that did come up during the trial.
Okay, now there are many inconsistencies mentioned in this case in some of the articles that I, read about. And they said that she had blood splatter on her hands in one of the reports. And but she didn't have any gunshot residue. And when asked about that, and asked if she had cleaned her hands before she called 911 or before the police arrived, she said that she did not know. So can you explain a little bit about why that would be her response, saying that she wouldn't know whether or not she cleaned her hands, or, why there would be splatter and not just blood from maybe trying to see if he was alive?
Well, and again, this was their argument, that she had cleaned her hands and there was a wipey or some kind of paper towel with some um, cleaner on the floor. And their argument was that she had cleaned her hands before police arrived. Now, she did have blood on the back of her hand and only on her right hand. And so that again drew some suspicion. But of course, my argument was the fact that she was on the phone with her left hand when she called 911, and then she called his parents shortly after that. But their argument, of course, was there was blood splatter in the back of the hand, is how they looked at it. But I saw it as the fact that she tried to provide some kind of medical aid to her husband at the time of him being shot. She didn't realize that he was actually shot. She just heard a pop, so she didn't know what it was until she saw the gun, which had landed on the couch. Um, so there was blood on her hand. They did try to say there was no blood on the front of her hand, or there was very little blood on the front of her hand. But again, there was blood all over the apartment where she had made an effort to get out of the apartment. So there was blood on a counter, blood on some walls, handprints, where she had made an effort to get out of the apartment without stepping on the blood and kind of tainting that area where her husband was lying. The other thing too is people who came over, her mother came over, the deceased father came over, and they were all trying to console her. And so she was hugging these people. And so my argument was, the blood would have come off on them. But they did argue that there was no GSR. GSR, again, is a gunpowder residue that's ejected from the handgun. This was a handgun, or a firearm for that matter. There was none on her hands at all, either one of them. They didn't test her clothing, so we didn't know whether or not she had any on her clothing. And this is the state of Texas, so they have a policy, Department of Public Safety, who did the lab work on this, have a policy that they weren't going to do the GSR testing on the deceased, even though they had taken the samples. Their conclusion was, regardless if it was a suicide or a homicide, he would have had GSR on him. So that was one of the big arguments as well moving forward, and them trying to explain to the jury that it was washed off.
Okay, and as her attorney, we all know that your job is to create reasonable doubt or to present facts that show that she is innocent. So in this case, do you think that there is anything that she could have done or said during the investigation and her interrogation to possibly have eliminated her even being charged?
That's a great question. And I tell this to all my clients and all your listeners, just don't say anything. She spoke to police numerous times. She talked to me even that evening, just a couple hours after it happened. They tried to console her and say that they were her friend and there to help her. But ultimately, they used whatever it is that she said against them. So, Miss Diaz, for whatever reason, decided to openly speak to police, not only the evening in which that happened, but also a week later, where she had a long interview with them, 2.5-hour interview shortly after she was released from the hospital where she was being treated for depression. So they did use all that against her. They did try to trap her into, which are tactics that they use, try to trap her into saying that they had her GSR, that had come back positive, and they had her DNA. She always stuck to her guns and said, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. But ultimately, she was arrested for the charge. So the best advice I can do is don't say anything. That was one of the things that drew the police suspicion and a reason, along with the gunshot placement, why they charged her. She just said too much, and it was inconsistent throughout. And then she also communicated with friends, whether she was there, or she wasn't in the room, or in the room. So those inconsistencies hurt her, and ultimately led to her being charged, a reason why she was charged.
Right. And so, just so the listeners, because before we get into how this has affected her and what possibly we could do, to help in this story, with this story, it is a possibility that people can be shocked to the point where they do not recollect things in the right chronological order, or if things ever happen, period. Correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. And she was in shock the night it happened, and I think it's affected her overall. But there was a mental health officer who was sent to kind of console her and keep an eye on her with the police department as they investigated. He did a wonderful job of keeping her calm and making sure that she was okay. They had taken her for an initial examination that night as well to make sure she was fine. So those resources were there, but yes, it was very traumatizing for her, and I think even till today has affected her.
Mhm. And just to be clear, they were only married for 6 months when this took place. Correct?
That's correct. It was a very short relationship, and that was brought up as to why something so volatile could have happened. Of course, I told the jury, I mean, you can't tell in a relationship. I mean, you can't dictate whether 6 months was too soon to know one another, or just a few months to then get married and have a child. So that was their decision, and although they tried to use that against him, which in my opinion and even my own experience doesn't make any sense.
Right. And with the facts, in these different reports, it was also mentioned that she was on some medication that most patients who have bipolar disorder take. And so that was presented by DHR Health. Was there a question as to her reaction while, they were investigating to her husband being killed or deceased?
Not so much. Honestly, I think they requested the DHR records, and one of the things that they used from the DHR records was the fact that she told whoever did the initial intake that she was in the room when he shot himself. So this was one of the inconsistencies throughout her sharing information with police and even the hospital, right? So she told police that she was in the bedroom. She told certain friends that she was there when it happened. And then she told DHR staff, or at least it was in their records, that she was in the same room when it happened. And so they used it for purposes of the inconsistencies. Now, she was on antidepressants, absolutely right. And it's also used to treat bipolar. Um, but they didn't really focus on that. I had to focus on that because the lead investigator, throughout his investigation and speaking to Miss Diaz, again, herself she made herself available for that. He kept saying that she was emotionless, that she showed no emotion considering her husband had just died. And part of the medication that she was on, uh, that's one of the side effects to the medication where you have a lack of affect. Right? And so this was the big deal. And that was pointed out in the DHR records, of which I used to explain why she didn't have normal emotions. Because it's common sense. If you're on an antidepressant, well, you assume that you're not going to be depressed or show those emotions, as even though they may be normal with the circumstances. So that's one of the things that they used against her also.
Right. And we know that any medication that you take that alters the brain in any way can definitely, mellow you out to where you don't, especially if it's strong enough, to where you don't have reactions or normal reactions in different situations, just because the medicine is, there to control your disorder, and we know that there are side effects to those meds. So I think that was important to point out. Um, in this case, what would you say has been the, most challenging for Miss Diaz in this case?
Sure. Yeah, Miss Diaz, at the time of her being married and at the time this happened, she was employed with one of the local school districts as a teacher. So she had her teaching certificate. Shortly after, I think her contract came up and the school district decided not to renew her. And of course, at that point, she's unemployable because of the allegations and the stigma that someone would have being charged with this kind of offense. She has not been able to find employment at this time. And, she still suffers, and I don't know if it's the medication or the trauma, but she does have issues with speech at times. She does stutter and seems to have difficulties moving forward with different thoughts that she may have.
Awesome. And so initially not wanting to, or voicing that she did not want to keep the child, and her now having, her 2-year-old with her now, how is she dealing with that and not having her husband present there with her?
Yeah, and I think that was one of the original ideas when she said she didn't want to keep the children, or her child, excuse me, because her husband wasn't going to be there to help raise him. She's doing a great job. She has a really great support system. Her mother's amazing and has been through her the whole time. So she's doing well. She's doing well with as in terms of being a mother and being present. Hmm.
Can you tell us, what would you like for people to take away from this story, or what would you like people to know? What is the most important takeaway from this?
I think most important, and in like Ms. Diaz's case, I view her as a victim from the very beginning. I mean, it was one of those sad situations where her husband did take his life, and a jury did acquit her of the murder charge. Um, Yet she was treated as if she were the assailant, and it's pretty sad situation for her to have gone through. And like I said, I've seen her kind of deteriorate. So I would just remind your listeners, don't talk to the police, don't volunteer any information. It never really helps. So I tell that to all my clients. And again, if you are a victim of something like this, make sure that you're clear, share the least amount of information you need to provide to police, and allow them to complete their investigation. Because again, it was initially called out as a suicide. So,
Okay, and why is it important that this story be told, across the nation?
because this can happen to anyone, and as I tell people, accusations are just words, but anybody could be in the same seat that Miss Diaz was and have her life in the hands of a jury. So again, this was a murder charge. It's punishable by 5 to 99 years of life in prison. So it's very serious, and I think that's most important. This can happen to any one of us, and I'm just thankful that for her it worked out. But I couldn't have imagined her having been convicted that night. The jury deliberated for 8 hours and came back with a not guilty verdict. So just the fact of the matter that this can happen to any one of us.
Right. And just to be sure, double jeopardy is attached to this, correct? Where she cannot be tried for this again if the prosecutors were to go back and say, no, we want to try her again.
Absolutely. Once you're acquitted by a jury, they cannot go back and recharge you on the case. As a matter of fact, I have filed a motion for an expunction, so everything will be erased from her record, so it won't show on her record. So we're still waiting on that to be complete. But hopefully, like I said, that'll happen and she can begin a new life.
Okay. And as of today, is this case keeping her from being able to move forward her life, like with finding employment, getting housing, and things of that sort?
I do think so because of the stigma. Even though she was acquitted from a jury, you just never know how an employer, even someone who may rent a home to her, views it. And that's one of the reasons why I did file that expunction. She is entitled to it, and that'll give her an opportunity to delete everything from her criminal history and be able to move forward as if it didn't happen. Now, again, it doesn't mean that the stigma goes away, but she is having problems and still lives with her mother.
Okay. Well, can you tell everyone if they would like to, reach out to you or have any questions or maybe like to hire you? Can you please tell everyone how they can contact and connect with you?
Absolutely, absolutely. You can call me at the office. My number is 956-261-5609, or you can look me up on the website, Tijerina Law Firm PC.com. Again, Tijerina Law Firm PC.com, and there is an option to be able to send me a message through the website. So feel free to communicate with me in any manner you'd like.
All right. So That is www.tijerlawfirmpc.com. For everybody that is listening and not watching, I want to thank you so much for being my guest today and for discussing this case with us. I think that it is very important. It is very serious charges, and she could have spent the rest of her life in prison for something she did not do. And then you would be then fighting the system to get something overturned. So I really, really appreciate you for coming on here and explaining the different reports and all the inconsistencies that were reported, and then clearing things up, and then, teaching us about what you should do in a situation like this.
Absolutely. Again, thank you for having me on, Lady J. I really do appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem. Is there anything else that you would like to say or leave our listeners and or viewers with?
No, I just wish everybody the best, and please think before you call the police, and give the police any statements. So
awesome. Well, we want to thank you guys again for tuning in for another edition of Ego Media Mayhem with Lady J, right here on JQLM Radio, division of Ego Entertainment Network.